Hello. This week we are talking about internal family systems as a modality. Um, we've talked about systems theory, we've talked about working with families, and internal family systems is applying a lot of those systemic principles and work with families and kind of those underlying principles that we know to the internal system. And then in working with the internal system of each individual, helping them be their best self in their family relationships and helping them make progress that way. I really enjoy internal family systems, and I'm excited to get to talk about it with you this week. Hopefully, the reading and the videos have helped you get a sense of this model. The first time I was exposed to it, it was a little weird. So I hope that questions will be answered, and then I will look forward to our Friday lab also for any additional questions or clarifications you have. So let's get started. The kind of creator of this model, as you have read, was Richard Schwartz, usually goes by Dick. And he is our first model creator who was actually a marriage and family therapist by training. He got a PhD in marriage and family therapy. So he was really exposed to all the systemic principles that we've been talking about, and particularly working with families. And so as he was doing some of the work with families, he came across issues where um, if he was working with one member of the family and was kind of noticing how the family perpetuated the problem in the individual, but then also noticed that there was some stuff going on inside of that individual that was perpetuating the problem also. And so as he was working with one person from the family, they would start to talk about parts. And he noticed that there was kind of similar dynamics internally as externally. We have talked about Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model and how systems are, kind of parallel each other, and we call that isomorphism, meaning that same shape is paralleled in different kind of levels. And so he decided, well, if kind of the same principles are applying inside as outside, maybe I will start to treat a person as if they have an internal family system. And that can feel a little bit weird. One client who I have been working with recently, though, as I was doing some IFS, and she is getting to the end of treatment, and we were doing like an internal exercise where she was working with various parts. And as they started to come in harmony and she had this kind of parts meeting within her, she said, it kind of just feels like a family council. And I was like, yes, it does. Anyway, people often, as you're working with them, just recognize it can sound odd from the outset, but as people start to do the work, they often are surprised to find out how easy it is. So let's see here. I am going to share a video that I actually created the last time I did this course, and was introducing internal family systems. Here we go.
Hey guys, internal family systems. That's what we're talking about today, and I am excited to get to share internal family systems with you because this might be my favorite modality. In fact, this is what I use for a lot of my therapy. Granted, that's mostly individual therapy, but I integrate it with emotionally focused therapy and interpersonal neurobiology for couples also. Anyway, when I was introduced to internal family systems, it was in my master's program, and we didn't even have a whole chapter in the book that we were learning from about IFS. We instead had a few articles, I think, that described some of the interventions. And as I read those, I was like, you're kidding, right? Who would do this and who would accept this as therapy. People would be super weirded out and would just leave. Anyway, now I do those very interventions, and interestingly, they go pretty well. So I hope your curiosity is piqued about these interventions that I'm talking about. First, though, I'm going to start you off with a little self-disclosure, as we say as therapists. This is my journal from middle school, and I was reading back through my journals, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I don't know why, but I was, and I found this passage, and it just made me grin because apparently at 13, I already figured out that I had parts and that all of this IFS stuff that I learned much later was going on inside of me. So here's what I wrote. I feel schizophrenic at times, in fact. Now, let me clarify. At that point in 7th or 8th grade, I thought schizophrenic meant multiple personality disorder, or dissociative identity disorder is what we call it now. Anyway, that's what I thought schizophrenia was. That's not what schizophrenia is, but anyway, there you go. Part of me will think a really bad word. Then another part of me, honestly, it's not the same part, because the first part is fuming and making fun of the second part. So the second part will apologize immediately and say, oh God, I'm so sorry I said that, and then mentally slap the first part. But I don't feel like either of those parts are me. I'm both. Well, some of each of them. And I listen to them and laugh at myself and think I must be schizophrenic. My relatives tell me it's normal, but I don't know. So there you go. 7th grade me had the experience of just having different parts, and some part felt just fine about swearing in frustration, and another part of me thought that was absolutely evil and I better not do it. And anyway, internal family systems is about getting to know our parts. One of the things I love about internal family systems also is the use of self. So in that journal entry, I pointed out that I knew that I wasn't either of those parts somehow, although they were part of me. In internal family systems, one of the first things we try to do is find the self. And you can know the self because there is calm and compassion and curiosity and confidence and courage and creativity and connection. All those alliterative words. I love it. I love alliteration. Anyway, all those C words, there's actually 8 of them, and I'll cover them later in this lecture. But those C words are for your core, which is self. And you can think of self, or maybe you can know that you've found self, if it kind of feels like you when you have the spirit. So you're seeing things lovingly, openly, with curiosity and compassion. And we try to bring that self energy to all these different parts. It's not mental illness to have different parts. Everybody has different parts, but mental illness can happen and distress can happen when parts get really polarized, or they become really extreme in the roles that they're trying to carry. And so what they need is to be heard and understood, and then we get to go in and explore what it is that this part is trying to accomplish. A basic presumption or assumption of IFS is that all parts have good intentions and they're trying to serve us in some way. Even the parts that seem super destructive and are problematic and people hate and wish they'd go away, all of those are trying to serve. So we will talk about that and about how we bring self to those parts and listen with openness and compassion and curiosity, and help de-escalate parts and help restore balance and order to the internal system and have self be in control. So there's a little sneak peek. I'm excited to share the rest with you.
Okay, so talking about parts, sometimes people resonate with that really quickly. Sometimes people struggle with that idea. And so I'm going to start right now talking about what parts are and how to kind of conceptualize what's going on so that you can kind of have a sense of that. So, we talked last week about polyvagal theory and went over how we have different physiological states with the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. And we noted the ventral vagal state, which is that safe state where we feel calm and kind of in control of ourselves. There can be that sense of flow and safety. And in that state, we can kind of be our best selves. Then there is sympathetic nervous system, which is where we have some kind of physiological responses. Heart maybe is beating faster. There's some danger, so we kind of have protective mechanisms. And then there's also dorsal vagal, which is that shutdown. So parts get associated with various physiological states, also some somatic experiences and beliefs and worldviews. The way Dick Schwartz conceptualized it, we have all of these parts inherently, we're kind of born with them. But as we experience life, we those parts can be kind of taken out of their original or intended and most helpful roles. And because of experiences that we have in the physiological states associated with them, they can be carrying burdens. Burdens that's an important concept in IFS. It basically means the beliefs, the experiences that didn't get processed effectively and continue on with that person kind of through time and then color and shape how they respond to other people, how they interact with the world, how they see themselves. So we have, if you look at this image on the bottom here, self, which is that safe, connected place. With the 8 C's, connection, that sense of connection is one of them. If you look at that, I am, I can, I must, I hurt, I can't, that also is a little bit reminiscent of the iceberg metaphor from Virginia Satir, that sense of self, I am at the bottom. And then there are those yearnings and some of the expectations and some of our fears and coping mechanisms, feelings, and then behaviors on top. So ventral vagal state, of course, that means there's that sense of safety. So there's flexibility. We can be in the front part of our brain where we can use all of our cognitive resources. And we also have the capacity to, in that state, kind of be sensing what's going on in all the rest of the brain, to be integrated. So we also, in that state, can sense what's going on in our body. Like I said, with polyvagal system or the polyvagal theory, the vagal nerve is getting a lot of information from the body and bringing it to the brain. But sometimes, because of trauma or other experiences, people kind of cut off from their bodies. It doesn't feel safe to feel their feelings, both emotionally and physically. And so they stop doing that. But in that self state, it is safe. And so it is okay to pick up the sensations of the body and to process them. So we have here that self on the bottom, a mindful, embodied reservoir of clarity, curiosity, compassion, calm, confidence, a sense of being, that this is our true self. This is just who we are, our being. And then part of the energy of self is that ability to connect compassionately with all of our different parts. So you see there, it says self-connection. The parts feel safe to relax and work as a team. Needs and feelings are attended to with compassion. Resilience develops, meaning something bad can happen, but if you can be in that self state, you have the resources to deal with it. You can mobilize various parts that might be helpful, but you can also heal from whatever kind of negative stuff happens because you see yourself as good. That humanistic view that I love from Satir. And any parts that felt traumatized or are carrying burdens can be compassionately accessed, and those burdens can be processed and healed. And then the part can go back to doing what it originally wanted to do, what feels good for it. So there's the possibility for individuation, play, growth, intimacy, learning, creativity, spontaneity, integration, rest, repair, and flourishing. So, of course, when we think of that ventral vagal state, that is the rest, repair, connect, or rest, digest, connect. So, being in that state really helps people not only feel calm and safe in themselves and be able to do some of the internal work, but also puts them in a state to be able to connect with other people, which is important when we're doing family therapy. So there is, in the diagram we had from last week, there's that kind of that lower where it's safe, or kind of sometimes it's shown in the middle, depends. Anyway, so that's in this model going to be that self state. So then we have sympathetic nervous system, that arousal, where physiologically maybe our heart is pounding, we're breathing more, blood is flowing to muscles, kind of extremities, and there's this sense of danger and I need to do something. Maybe I must do something. So there's different kinds of protectors in internal family systems. There's kind of managing protectors, and there are kind of more vigilant, like soldier-like protectors. And so the managing protectors sometimes can kind of blend with and want you to think that they are self, but their energy is a little bit different. They do perceive dangers and want to help fix things. So we see their fight and flight. There's also that fix. So the fixing protectors, you can see there, it says they're hypervigilant. They may kind of bully other parts or other people. They might bring up addictions or unhealthy coping mechanisms because that's what they know how to do in order to get you out of whatever is they're afraid of happening or taking over. They can be controlling, manic, rebellious, rushing, quitting, anxiety, being a martyr. It might look like ADHD or OCD, like OCD, that obsessive compulsive disorders. Like, I have to constantly be checking. I don't feel safe. I'm afraid something bad is going to happen. And so I'm constantly checking, constantly doing little rituals that I think will bring me safety, that to our rational mind, we know that, flipping a switch 5 times isn't really going to change anything. We know that here, cognitively, logically, in self, we know that. But to that protective part that's trying to keep you safe, like, it doesn't have good resources. And maybe it comes from a younger state, or maybe there's like some other thing that gave it this idea, I need to do this or something bad will happen. From whatever experience it came from, can be kind of like a superstitious type of thing in that one part. So cynicism, perfectionism, those can also be, like, all of those traits are parts of, or strategies, I would say, of protective parts. Then we have exiles, and exiles are parts that carry heavy burdens that are so dangerous, that could be so destructive to our sense of self, that the protectors and managers have decided that they are not okay to have, and they get kind of shoved. And so those, both the physiological states, maybe there's a feeling of being terrified or a feeling of being helpless or hopeless or powerless, and then the beliefs that go along with those. And so they are dangerous to the system. If the person starts being in that state, it could shut everything down. They don't function anymore. And so other parts are like, yeah, we're not doing that. And so they get, those exiles get shoved, and the protective and managing parts will do whatever it takes to keep those exiles and the feelings associated with it and the states associated with it from coming up, because then the person's not functional anymore. They can't keep themselves safe. They can't do whatever they need to do. So you see there under exiles, it says, without the support to process them, overwhelming feelings must be stored away. This creates a reservoir of banished, often young, not always young, but often, because when you're younger, you just have fewer resources. You are more vulnerable. Often young parts holding unprocessed rage, terror, grief, shame, hopelessness, sometimes as physical symptoms. In exile, they keep trying to be heard and helped, and they get activated or like triggered by events that remind them of whatever event put them in that, or whatever burdens they're carrying. Protectors try to keep exiles away either by managing proactively or firefighting reactively. We'll talk about firefighters in a minute. Using whatever survival strategies they originally found to help. So those protective parts are going to use whatever strategies they have, not necessarily that those strategies are really effective either at maintaining the exile in exile or in living a full functional life, but that's what they have, that's what they know. And so their intention is good, even if they are actually being destructive. So when we have some trauma, and that can be a big T trauma or a little t trauma, and it's too much for our kind of psyche to process, like we don't know how to make sense of it, it just feels overwhelming. Those memories and experiences, if they're not processed, they're just kind of held in storage. And you guys know about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also complex PTSD, which is like if the trauma has happened again and again and again and again, like in the case of childhood abuse, or sometimes like war vets will have complex PTSD because they were serving for a long time. And so some of those experiences are so overwhelming, the brain can't process them, doesn't know how to fit them in kind of a structure that allows the person to continue living normally. And so they just get stored. And then those can come up as flashbacks, which can be devastating and can definitely be disruptive. They can come up just as beliefs or feelings, again, that are disruptive. And so there's a reason that these protective parts and these managing parts don't want the exile to come up, because it really is frightening for the whole system. It really does create this state in which the person doesn't function very well. So I mentioned I would talk more about firefighters versus protectors and managers. So firefighters are part of that kind of protectors class. Protectors are managers. So I think of managers as being maybe a little bit more innocuous, doing things like, being very scheduled or something like that. So we often let managers run our life and don't even realize that it's not our true self. Managers are just kind of innocuously doing what they need to do in order to keep us going and functioning. Then those protectors, so protectors is like the whole class, but we're breaking them down. So then the managers are kind of more innocuous. Then there's these protectors that maybe are pushing people away. Maybe their strategies are a little bit more defensive, more reactive. And often managers and those protectors and also firefighters, I'll get to those in a second, will become polarized. Like, for example, just this week, I talked to someone who had a manager that wanted her to feel like a good person and do the right thing. And then there was a protector who said, if I do that thing that this manager wants me to do, it's actually going to dysregulate me. And I don't know what to expect. And I just want things to be calm. Turns out the manager also wanted things to be calm, but the manager and the protector really disagreed about how to get that calm, harmonious state. And so there was like that kind of butting heads, and they became polarized. And internally, there was a lot of conflict and a sense of like, I don't like that part, and I wish that part would just disappear. So clearly, that wasn't self energy. Okay, then there's firefighters, and protectors are firefighters. I think of firefighters as being the most extreme. So there's a lot of kind of protective, defensive mechanism things that we can do that people just kind of take as a matter of course. You know, sometimes people are just in a bad mood or are kind of grumpy or push people away or critical or things like that. But when I'm thinking about firefighters, I'm thinking about things that are clearly destructive, like alcohol addiction, like self-harm, suicidal ideation, or even suicide attempts. Things that, or could be things like eating disorders where somebody is literally starving themselves to death. So it's firefighters are quite extreme, but firefighters come up when it seems like that exile is going to take over and they don't know how else to stop it. And so those kind of extreme, dangerous, self-destructive coping mechanisms are still coping mechanisms. Those firefighters still have good intentions. They still want the person to be able to function, but they don't know how to do that. And so their very strategy to help the person becomes quite self-destructive. Okay, at the top, we have those freeze protectors, collapse. So another way that people can protect themselves is instead of getting mobilized to get shut down. So that could look like, well, I'm working with somebody who has a kind of a freeze protector, and she says that that protector part just needs to conserve energy and feels like there's so much going on in her life that she doesn't have emotional energy for, that even to just be able to survive, it kind of has to shut her down. And that can look like kind of confusion, disorientation, dissociation, can look like, there you see fainting, narcolepsy, chronic fatigue, numbness, suicidal ideation. Can be that kind of submit response, like we talked about fight, flight, fawn. This is, of course, fawn to the lowest, or the it's not even like a fawn, but it's like complete collapse. So it's more like playing dead, because now we're in dorsal vagal rather than sympathetic nervous system. Sorry. So that can look like depression, can look like just being completely resigned to things, that dissociation, numbness, numbing addictions, things like that. So those are also protectors, but instead of like mobilizing protectors and fixing protectors, they're protectors that just kind of shut everything down. So you see there the freeze response, collapse. This is dorsal vagal. There is hypoarousal. So hyper means too much, hypo means not enough. Hypoaroused sympathetic nervous system, because we've slammed really hard on the brakes and come to a full stop. And they're seeking safety through disconnecting from the world. Okay, I hope that's clear so far. Of course, if you have questions, I'll look forward to answering them in the labs. These parts, you have seen them in media. We're going to watch a couple of videos now. One where is from that movie Inside Out. And then the other one is an explanation about where our parts come from, which I've kind of talked about a little bit, but I really like this video. It's pretty clear and concise. So let me pull those up.
So, as it turns out, the green trash can is not recycling. It's for greens, like compost and eggshells. And the blue one is recycling. And the black one
Riley is acting so weird. Why is she acting so weird?
What do you expect? All the islands are down.
Joy would know what to do.
That's it. Until she gets back, we just do what Joy would do.
Great idea. Anger, fear, disgust. How are we supposed to be happy?
Hey, Riley, I've got good news. I found a junior hockey league right here in San Francisco. And get this, tryouts are tomorrow after school. What luck, right?
What do we do?
Guys, here, you pretend to be Joy.
Won't it be great to be back out on the ice?
Oh yeah, that sounds fantastic.
What was that? That wasn't anything like Joy.
Because I'm not Joy?
Yeah, no kidding.
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure.
Something's wrong.
Should we ask her?
Let's probe, but keep it subtle so she doesn't notice. So, how was the first day of school?
She's probing us.
I'm done. You pretend to be Joy.
What? Okay.
It was fine, I guess. I don't know. Oh, very smooth. That was just like Joy.
Something is definitely going on.
She's never acted like this before. What should we do? We're going to find out what's happening, but we'll need support. Signal the husband. Ahem.
With a nice pass over the reed, comes across that right.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
What? Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What? What is it, woman? What?
He's making that stupid face again.
I could strangle him right now.
Signal him again.
So, Riley, how was school?
Are you kidding me?
For this, we gave up that Brazilian helicopter pilot?
Boo! I'll be Joy.
School was great, all right?
Riley, is everything okay?
Sir, she just rolled her eyes at us.
What is her deal? All right, make a show of force. I don't want to have to put the foot down.
No, not the foot.
Riley, I do not like this new attitude. Oh, I'll show you attitude. No. Stay happy.
What is your problem? Just leave me alone.
Sir, reporting high levels of sass.
Take it to DEFCON 2.
You heard that, gentlemen? DEFCON 2.
Listen, young lady, I don't know where this disrespectful attitude came from. You want a piece of this, Pops? Come and get it!
Yeah, well...
Here it comes. Prepare the foot.
Keys to safety position. Ready to launch on your command, sir.
Just shut up!
Fire! That's it. Go to your room. Now.
Foot is down. The foot is down.
Good job, gentlemen. That could have been a disaster.
Well, that was a disaster.
Come, fly with me, gatinha.
Okay. So that was one video, and these is just a movie. There wasn't self in either of these. There was just parts, and in Inside Out, each of the parts is represented by an emotion, which is not as kind of sophisticated as parts are in IFS. In IFS, parts can actually have a range of emotions, a range of experiences. They're like little people inside of us, with their own desires and hopes and conflicts and things like that. But it's a fun little clip, and it's interesting to see how those parts are portrayed and what happens when things are going wrong, and how different people's parts interact with each other, and have different takes on the situation, which is important for family therapy, with IFS, with family therapy, because people's parts do interact, and one person's defensive part will bring up another person's defensive part, which then maybe triggers a fear, that exile, or there's just, or maybe it triggers a firefighter. So helping people recognize what's going on within them in terms of those parts can be really valuable. Also, we saw a little bit of dissociation, kind of a normal, healthy level of dissociation in that clip. Dad started off dissociating, like not being present with the environment by kind of envisioning this hockey game. Mom dissociated at the end, remembering the Brazilian helicopter pilot. So those things where we're just kind of not really present and we're just thinking about something else entirely in our mind happens pretty regularly. All right, so next video now, talking about how parts are created and just a little bit more about parts in general. All right, here we go.
So the truth is, while during our childhood we are constantly learning about reality and what to expect and how to respond, once we have those assumptions, we pretty much just stick with them through the rest of our adult life. Why? It would just simply be too cumbersome to always be walking around like willing to learn how to be human again, fresh every day, with no assumptions about what's about to happen and how should I respond. So once we kind of have the learning down, we just automate it and assume that those rules are going to stick with us and we can use them in an unconscious way moving forward. The problem is those expectations or rules don't always serve us anymore. Why? Well, they're based on a reality we're no longer in. At the very least, we are no longer the same. We're not the same people. We're adults now. And as adults, we have different capacities and different options. We're also very, very likely around different people. And it's nice if our brain can get that memo, sort of. Now, certainly we do learn from our adult experiences, but usually those learnings kind of exist in different memory systems so that the new learning can be parallel and in competition with the old without necessarily changing what we originally learned. And therapies like CBT do a good job of sort of bolstering or strengthening the new learning so it can compete and perhaps even override our original felt sense of reality. And that produces incremental change, which is a good thing. But today I want to talk to you about transformational change, to borrow a term from Bruce Ecker. And in transformational change, we actually go to the original learning itself, update it with new information, so that then whatever symptoms or struggles were sort of launched by this belief that I can't trust people or I have to always please them, whatever outcome from this belief can sort of naturally dissolve ongoingly without constantly having to try to override it or convince ourselves that it is a good idea to do something that is different than what our original learning taught us. So those original learnings traditionally have been called schemas. So we'll use that term. So some examples of schemas are, in order to get attention, I have to be perfect, or I have to be bad. If I let myself feel sad, I'll be rejected. And then I'll be alone with the sadness in a way that's so overwhelming that I have to find a way to not let myself feel sadness. So these underlying associations and beliefs about how the world works, these schemas, they exist in something called implicit memory. Now, scientists used to believe that implicit memory, once it was encoded, could not be changed. But now we schemas. So there's all sorts of tricks that people have developed to make this process easier, many of which use imagination. One of my favorite of these is what's called doing parts work. In other words, picturing these little schemas as a little person. As crazy as that sounds, when we picture that as a little personality or a little creature or person inside our mind, it makes it easier for the brain to both ask questions and listen for answers. Simply because the brain's just much more accustomed to dialoguing with people. So if you picture it in that way, the brain's just on more familiar territory. And also, these little schemas, they have within them like a worldview, an expectation of reality, emotions, and behavioral impulses, behavioral patterns. So if you think about it, in a way, they are like these little simplified people or personalities. So actually the metaphor, that image, helps the brain kind of collect what otherwise could seem kind of complex into one image because we're used to people being that complex. We're used to them having a take on reality and a behavior. So that image actually will capture for us, make it more concrete for our mind. If we tune into a behavioral pattern or a critical inner voice and say, okay, if that were a person, what would it look like? Okay, that's me at 10 years old, kind of curled up, I'm scared. And I'm telling myself these things. Or that's a part of me that's like really tough and trying to, it's like a little scrappy, inner part, and she's angry. So we might begin to have an image like that simply because then we've like more localized that schema and can more comfortably begin to have a conversation or relationship with it. So we might ask the little girl who's in the corner, like, okay, what are you doing there? Why are you so scared? Why are you curled up? Why are you disconnecting from everybody you love? And then if we asked it kindly, which interestingly, the rules of relationships still apply. Like if we go to a part of our mind and are critical, like, God, why are you so afraid? Get over it. We're not going to get information. But if we go nicely and really sincerely ask, then that part will give us the response back and begin to open for us the information that is held in that part of the brain. So there are many forms of therapy that work this way with parts, most famously internal family systems. There's even a book called Self Therapy that teaches you how to work with your own parts in that manner. But whatever technique you use, the important thing is to figure out what your mind believes. And when you're approaching that mission, the first step is to start with where you're suffering. So figure out what point of suffering or what pattern that either causes me pain or causes me to get stuck. What is it that I don't like about my own way of processing life? It's easiest if you can start with a behavioral response, like something you actually do, like criticizing yourself, or gosh, I always nag at my husband, or always shut down when someone's giving me a compliment. But you can also start with just an anxious feeling or a depressed mood. But either way, begin to bring it into focus. If you do it like with parts work, you might see a person, or you might just find it in your body, like this is where that place lives. And then other images like a black hole or an animal might come. But sure enough, information will begin to come into awareness, like associations that can give some meaning as to what's the beliefs that underlie either that feeling or that behavioral pattern. So let's just say the pattern is self-criticism. So you might tune in, you might picture the inner critic if you want to do it with parts, and ask it, what are you afraid would happen if you stopped criticizing me? Again, that's what we're getting toward. What are you afraid would happen if you stopped doing X, Y, and Z? Or if you don't want to do parts work, you can just tune into, God, when I'm feeling self-critical, there's like this tightness in my chest. And you might just stay there and say, okay, and fill in the sentence, I must be self-critical. I must tell myself I'm bad because if I don't, and just see what comes. Try it a number of times. I must tell myself I'm bad because if I don't, begin to let the sort of coherent, meaningful, like the way that this actually does make sense and it is a weird way adaptive or a solution to a problem, beginning to assume it's there and letting that information emerge. If it really doesn't feel like an adaptation, like it just feels like a sadness, and maybe you can even identify a part, like that's me at 10 years old when my dad died or something. Well, it may be more like a memory of an emotion or an emotional truth of like aloneness, because there really was a time you were alone. In that moment, the next step would be to just show up for that part and give support, love, self-compassion, connection in a way that is actually a disconfirmation, because it's saying, oh, there's this deep sense of aloneness, but I'm here. But sometimes just giving care to a place that's simply scared or hurting can be a wonderful first step.
All right, so I love that video. She does a great job of explaining some things. Now we're going to go back to our PowerPoint. If I can, let's get there. Okay, here we are again. So, I had already explained about different kinds of parts, and this is a graphic that I like. Um, kind of explains, shows some of those. Oops. Again, we'll get to that reflection question in a minute. So we have these different kinds of parts. Self, again, that's like the ventral vagal energy, that core center of the person. Of course, Satir um, recognized it as I am. Um, when differentiated, this can be the leader. And that's one of the goals in IFS. You want self to get to be the leader, because when self is the leader, it's like having, this maybe sounds sacrilegious, but it's like having the best in you, the divinity within you, like having Christ come back to the earth, and you get to, all of these parts come, and there is that kind of energy of compassion and confidence and courage and creativity and connection and calm, that is so, so powerful. So the exiles, of course, hold those painful emotions that have been isolated from the conscious self for protection of the system or for the part's safety. So the parts, like other parts of the system, like the managers, those protectors, those exiles can become extreme in their efforts to be cared for and can share their story. Those exiles carry burdens from being wounded, like the rage, dependency, shame, fear or terror, grief or loss, loneliness, the sense of worthlessness, things like that. Firefighters, as I said, they're also protectors, but they're more extreme. They act after exiles are upset to either soothe the system or distract the system. So maybe they take some medications or drugs or alcohol, something like that, to just calm things down, or maybe do some self-harm or have risky sex or whatever to just distract. Any activity can be used to get away from exiles. Some examples might be sleep, shopping, work, sex, diet, exercise, computer, video games, addictions, binging, suicidality, self-harm, violence, dissociation, distraction, obsession, fantasy. And then, of course, those managers are also protectors, and they attempt to keep the person in control of the situation and relationships in order to protect them from feeling hurt or rejected. So that might be kind of controlling behavior, striving, like being a perfectionist, being a caretaker of other people. Like some people just feel like they have to make everybody else around them happy. They have to suppress their own needs, take care of everybody else's needs. That's manager. They might be judgmental or critical, passive, aggressive, just passive, pessimist, a planner, self-critic, things like that. So in internal family systems, as I've said, all of the parts are welcome. And that is something that, we've talked about how the therapist has to stay differentiated or grounded or compassionate, see the best. That's one of these really important things. So no matter what part I am presented with as a therapist, I need to be able to keep that self energy and be curious about it and be compassionate and stay calm, even if other parts of the person's system or the client's system really don't like that part. I can model that the part is welcome and that we can get to know the part and try to help that person get into self, because that's where the really powerful healing happens. So, some understandings that help me keep that perspective that all parts are welcome is knowing, and like I have worked with so many parts and they really all do have good intention. They're all trying to serve in the best way they know how. Also, parts do get polarized with each other when their strategies interfere with one another. I gave an example of that. And one of the things, if you've got two polarized parts, it can be really hard to get to self, because both of those parts are afraid that if they take a step back, the other one will just jump in and run the show and ruin everything. So sometimes you have to work with each part. You have to reassure each part. You have to address their fears. What are you afraid is going to happen? What would you like for this person? And slowly, as the parts start to hear about the other part and that really their intention isn't bad, it can become safer to take a step back and let self emerge. Parts blend with the self when they believe the self needs protection. One of the things that can happen is maybe there's a manager part or a part that's kind of been running the show for a long time. And when you ask that part why it feels like it has to step in, it has to run the show, it can't step back, often it thinks that the person, the client, is still a child. Like that's the last thing that it knew. It stepped in and took over because it felt like it had to in order to survive, in order to help the person survive. And so kind of updating it, letting that part see where the person actually is, can be really a powerful experience. Parts will not unblend from the self. They will not take a step back unless they believe or hope that it is safe to do so. They're not going to abandon their post because that could have devastating consequences. And they each feel like very important to the system. Their contribution is essential to the system. And so they're not going to abandon the post. They have to believe that it's okay for them to be relieved from their duty for a short time because there's somebody else with more power, like self, or sometimes the therapist, that will manage things in that moment and will take care of parts so that the healing can happen. And hopefully, like, if you can give that part a sense of this is what can happen, would you like to not have to take on this protective role so much? It sounds exhausting. Often parts are very exhausted because they only have this one strategy and it's not working very well, and they don't feel appreciated and they don't feel seen, and it just gets to be a pretty miserable place to be. But when those parts do feel seen and heard and appreciated, and they understand that there is relief out there, that they maybe don't have to keep holding that role, keep doing that thing that's been so exhausting, that can be really relieving, and they're willing to take a step back. Often the client, the person, doesn't realize that it's not self that's running the show, it's some other part. But I do hear a fair amount from people, I just don't feel like myself. I want to feel like myself again. And so it's nice to help them feel like themselves again, be back in that core self, bring that self energy and that self leadership to their internal system. All right, so a reflection question. What are some of the parts of yourself that you notice? I shared in that little video about middle school me, and a part that would swear in my head if something frustrating happened. Often happened more after reading a book that there was swearing in, like Catcher in the Rye. I remember that really threw me for a loop. Anyway, when do those parts of you come up? Another part that I've shared in past lectures is the part that when I'm feeling like a failure, which is going to be an exile, I start to be critical of my husband, which is a protector. So once I can take a step back from that and realize, oh, that's what's going on, this exile is getting triggered, the protector steps in to kind of push the exile aside to like calm things down. And its strategy, it knows, is to point a finger and be critical, because that's what I saw growing up. So we can start to understand that. So what parts of you come up? When do they come up? Are there parts that other parts of you resent? Are there parts that seem to run the show for you? So I'm eager to hear or to read in digital dialogue what some of the parts of you notice are. Okay, so as a therapist in therapy, how do we know which parts we're dealing with? This little graphic, the artistry is not outstanding, but if you look carefully, you can see there on the top, this is kind of the self and self energy. And then we have various parts here. And parts often, they're adopting worldviews. Schemas is the word that was used in that video we watched. And so those schemas get learned from somewhere, and it's often the people around and the interactions with your family members growing up. And so it's normal to internalize voices from your parents or from siblings or from a teacher. And those parts start to use the same strategy that that person who was outside of you was using, but now they're using it internally. So you can see, we've got here this kind of, it looks like a disciplinarian, grumpy teacher who's probably going to criticize. We've got, looks like a bookworm, an artist, tree hugger, happy grandma. We've also got this kind of old, feeble, like I'm helpless, I can't do anything. We've got this little girl, looks kind of scared. To me, that this character looks like, I don't know, attractive, appealing, young, kind of this like idea of sexuality maybe. Then we've got this kind of rebel part. We've got this fighter, protector part, and we've got this moral kind of conscience part. So when you're listening to somebody talking about themselves, you can start by hearing like words that they say. And if you really have this conceptualization, maybe as somebody is talking about an interaction that they had, or their relationship with a child, one of their children, or with their husband, you can start to hear different parts and different points of view and conceptualize, I think there's a manager at work here, or there's a protective kind of defensive part at work here. You can also watch. So when I'm doing internal work with people, for example, if maybe we're doing some internal work and there is an exile that we're accessing finally, that the protectors felt like self was safe enough to be able to see the exile, and so the protectors have stepped back, and now we're getting to contact and access that exile. And sometimes exiles and their desire to be seen and heard will just blend with the self. And you can actually, as you're kind of coming into contact, ask that the exile not do that, and reassure the exile that the reason for them to not blend is because when they're blended, we don't get to bring help. They aren't really seen and heard by another safe source. And so exiles will often say, okay, I'm willing to not blend, but sometimes they do start to blend. And as you ask questions, like if I am watching somebody, maybe I'll see them go from a clearly calm, kind of compassionate, curious state, and then maybe their face will start to get red and they'll start to tear up. And I'm like, exile is blending, because I can see that physiological state shift as they go to another part. And so I'll maybe pause. It looks like that exile is blending with you right now. Do you feel kind of overwhelmed with their sadness? Yes. Okay, I'm going to just ask that exile to take a step back. Again, we appreciate the exile, the burdens that it's carrying. We just want to help, and we can't help when that exile blends. Would the exile be willing to take a step back? Often we're not calling it an exile. The person can come up with a name that part maybe feels most comfortable with. Sometimes parts get named by other parts, and often that's not a very flattering name. So we can kind of shift that as we go along. Then also we can ask. So one of the powerful tools in IFS is when you've got a part coming up, people can identify that part. hopefully can take a step back from that part. But once they take a step back, they're not automatically in self. And so a really key question is, how do you feel towards that part? And sometimes people will say, I'm scared of that part. I want to stay as far away from it as I can. Or I'm really mad at it. I'm really frustrated that it does what it does. Or um, I feel kind of indifferent. I really don't care about that part. So all of those energies obviously are not self energy. You can tell when somebody is in that self energy. Again, this is back to listen because you've just asked. If there's a sense of, I'm curious about that part, or I feel compassion for that part. Or sometimes people will say something and I'm not quite clear. And so I'll just ask again. Maybe they say, I feel kind of like I kind of pity that part. Is that pity more of a, like, you don't think very well of that part? You're kind of like a condescending pity, or does that feel more like a compassionate pity? And then people can tell you how they feel towards that part. So, um, usually I won't proceed until we can get to self. If it's really challenging to get to self, we can work with the two parts. And sometimes the therapist will step in as self to model that self energy and to interact with those parts in a loving, compassionate, connected, confident, curious way. And that can be really helpful. So we are now going to watch another video. This gives you an opportunity to kind of experience in the moment some of your parts. It's an exercise run by Frank Anderson, who works a lot with IFS and trauma, and he's a great trainer. I've gotten to attend trainings by him before. Anyway, don't phone this one in. Really engage. Don't just watch. Really try to engage. Try to do this exercise, because there will be a reflection and question about it afterwards. So let me pull that up. Okay, here we go. You can see that those colors are reminiscent of the Inside Out movie. And in fact, IFS practitioners were consulted in the making of that movie. Okay, here we go.
So why don't you kind of settle into your seat, see if you can get comfortable. Close your eyes if you want. You don't have to do that, but remember that kind of going inside piece that IFS does. And I'm going to ask you to think in your mind's eye of someone who is particularly triggering. Someone who kind of gets your goat. And when you have that person in mind, I'm going to ask you to put them in a room that has a window and a door. And once they're in that room, I'm going to ask that you be on the outside looking in, knowing that it's safe. And I want you to have them do the thing that they do that really activates you or triggers you. And as they're doing that thing, I'm going to ask you to notice any of your feelings, thoughts, or sensations that come up within you as you see this person doing this. And as you notice that, or as you're aware, we're going to ask those parts of you to separate from you a bit so that you can get to know them a little bit better. And see here if you can kind of pick out maybe the one reaction or sensation or feeling that is the strongest. And if that part is willing to separate from you, just enough, maybe just a little, so that you can extend some curiosity, so that you can maybe get to know it a little bit better. Why does it feel the need to react this way? Maybe where does that reaction come from? What is that part's fear if it didn't do what it's doing when that person in the room does that thing? And if there are any other curiosities that you have, just ask. And see if the part is willing to share that with you. And as this part is sharing with you, I'd like you to extend it some gratitude for letting you know a little bit more about it. Maybe you have the intention that you're going to follow up with it and learn more about it. And I'd like to see now if your parts or parts are willing to either step behind you to fully separate from you, and to either step behind you or stay behind as you walk into that room with that person. Whatever feels safe for you. And see if your parts will let you be with this person without them for just a minute. And they can observe you. Being with this person, doing what they do. And when that feels complete, see if you can just see or notice how your parts saw you differently from them. And maybe this is something that you can do when you encounter this person the next time, is be with them as your parts watch, if it feels safe to you and to them, or not. It's just a suggestion. And when it feels right, come back to
Okay. Let's get back to the okay, so kind of the outline of the exercise that Frank Anderson took us through there is to think of that person who is particularly triggering. Imagine putting that person in a room with a window and door. Put yourself on the outside looking in, knowing you're safe. In your mind, have the person do what is triggering. Notice those feelings, thoughts, sensations, etc. I'm not going to read all of it. You can see it there if you want to. I did that exercise again and had another experience of getting to understand some of my own parts and helping some of my parts who just really wanted to avoid that triggering person. Like, they put them in a room with a window and a door, and then we're like, we're out of here. We're running across the other side of the world, and we're not coming back, and we're not looking back, and we're certainly not looking into the window. So, then kind of through the exercise helped them find a way that they could stay safe while I could approach that person. And it's really interesting and revealing to me. Anyway, I look forward to reading about your experiences with that too. So, what was your experience like with that insight exercise? What did you notice? Were your parts able to step back? Were they not able to step back? Were these parts that you are familiar with? Were they parts that come up particularly with a particular person? Anyway, whatever you are comfortable sharing. So now, how do we put this together? This has been a lot of kind of an individual focus. So how do we do this when we're in a couple setting or in a family setting? So I do work with each individual and together when I've got a couple. We'll talk about, maybe they'll say, oh, we had this interaction this week and it was terrible. And we really want our communication to be better. I hear that so often. Communication needs to be better. Anyway, so I'll say, okay, walk me through what happened. And so as they walk me through, I'll slow it down, pause. What was going on for you at that moment? What did that mean for you? And kind of help them begin to understand what parts were getting triggered, what parts were coming up, what their strategies were. Were those managers? Were they protectors? What exile got triggered that was kind of fueling the need for protectors? If the interaction did not go well, you can be sure it was not two selves that were talking to each other. There were definitely some other parts involved in this interaction. So then I work with a person to understand their own internal system a little bit. And then once they can understand that, I might ask, how would it be to turn to your partner and share what you understand now about what was going on for you? This is a really interesting thing, and I see it again and again. But somebody can be talking to me about it, knowing cognitively somewhere in there that their partner is right next to them, hearing everything that they're saying. But when I ask them to turn to their partner and say that, sometimes they get shut. There's a part that'll come up as like, no, that does not feel safe. Or maybe they'll start into it, and I can tell that the energy behind it kind of turns into a blaming or a defensive energy instead of maybe that self energy that they got to and they were being understanding, compassionate with their own parts. So I'll pause them and just reflect. It sounds like it's really hard to share this vulnerable thing. I think I heard some kind of defensiveness and maybe some blame coming into your communication instead of just being able to be open and vulnerable with what we just talked about. Does that feel like what happened? Often people will be like, yeah, that totally happened. And so maybe you'll slow it down even more and say, it sounds like there's part of you that would like to be able to share this. Another part says it's not safe to share. Could you tell the other person that, just that there's part of me that feels like it's not safe to be vulnerable with you yet. And I want to be, there's part of me that really wants to connect with you, but it's really hard right now. So we can kind of do the meta, kind of get levels until they're able to talk to their spouse about what's going on. And then I'll check in with the other spouse. And sometimes they get triggered. But if the person is able to express from that self energy with self leadership, saying what's going on with their parts, that often creates safety. And so the other person can listen from that self state. So an example might be, after we've done this work, there's part of me that's afraid that you don't think well of me. And I'm not good enough to deserve you because my ex-husband always treated me like I was a pathetic failure. So in order to protect me from feeling like a pathetic failure, there's this defensive part that keeps coming up and finding things wrong with you. And there's another part of me that knows that criticizing you is only going to push you away and it doesn't want to criticize you. But the critical part just comes up and is stronger. I really want you to think well of me. I really want to feel safe and connected with you. And it's really hard because this critical part keeps coming up because I'm so afraid you won't think well of me. Something like that. So you could see there's this part of me that is afraid you don't think well of me and I'm not good enough to deserve you because my ex-husband always treated me like I was a pathetic failure. So there's the exile, right? That's this belief that usually gets pushed away. I don't want to deal with it, don't want to think about it. But the energy and the fear and all that stuff from the exiles is fueling the interaction. So then a protector comes up in order to protect me from feeling like worthless or like you couldn't love me, that I don't deserve you. There's a defensive part that comes up and finds things wrong with you. So this defensive part thinks, well, if I can point out that there's something wrong with my spouse, then they can't think that there's something so wrong with me that I'm unlovable because there's obviously something wrong with them too. That strategy obviously is not going to create what the parts want, but it's the strategy that they know. Then here's a managing part. There's another part of me that knows criticizing you will only push you away, and I don't want to do that. So, maybe even as she's being critical, there's another part in her head that's like, stop it, dummy. He's not gonna, this is gonna make him like you less, being critical of him all the time. So we've got that exile, we've got a protector, we've got a manager, all of those. And then here's the self energy. I really want you to think well of me. I really want to feel safe and connected with you. That's quite a vulnerable stance to admit that desire for connection, that hope to be thought well of. And so in self, where there is calm and confidence and self-compassion and clarity about what's wanted and courage to say things, that can be said. No protector will let the person say that. Because it's just not safe. So the protectors have to be willing to stand back. They might switch it like you never think well of me, or I just don't feel safe around you. And you can hear how that is kind of a similar message, but said with a very different energy. A protective part would be happy to say, I don't feel safe around you. Where in self, they can say, I really want to feel safe and connected with you. So that's kind of an image, a glimpse of that. And then, both people are able to talk about it. And then maybe parts have things they want to say about, this is an experiment I can do that, I want to check and see if my spouse is safe. And so I'm going to do this one thing, see how it goes. Or maybe the couple wants to work on something together. They have an idea about what would help their parts feel safer. Okay, with couples and families now, when I'm working with families, I kind of make the assumption, I conceptualize it as the parents who have more resources and more experience need to be the ones to kind of exude and exemplify that self energy. So I'll start with parents often. And when kids want to say something, because their kids' parts need to be heard too, I'll coach parents of how to listen so that feeling of safety and attachment can be there for the kids, so that their protectors don't come up and just shut things down. So I can help parents recognize what parts of them come up in response to the kids. So maybe the kid says something like, you're never around. And of course, if the parent was in self, they'd say, wow, that must feel really lonely. You must worry that I don't care because I'm just not there for you. Now, if the kid hears that, probably they're going to start crying, yes, and they just needed to be heard and seen and know that their parent is there for them. But if the parent is not in that self place, which is more likely, they're likely to respond defensively. What do you mean I'm never there for you? I do this and this and this for you. How can you say that? And you can see that would shut the kid down. So parents can help kids process their own experiences by bringing that self energy to a situation that creates safety and promotes the kid's ability to notice and accept their own experiences. I talked a little bit earlier about how sometimes it's not safe to feel. It's not safe to feel our emotions. It doesn't feel safe to feel somatically what's going on in our body. If parents don't make it safe for their kids to feel because parents reject or shut down the emotions, or if there's abuse, and so recognizing the feelings is just really triggering, that can do this too. But if the parent can create a sense of safety and reflect the kid's emotions and identify those kids' emotions, then it becomes safe for the kid to have the emotion, to process the emotion, to befriend the parts, to befriend the experiences, to change their relationship with things. It can be really powerful. One of the things I talk to parents about is what matters most is not what you did, because as a parent, you're going to make mistakes. Surprise, you're human. But what you do after what you did. So maybe a kid comes to you and is upset about something and you respond defensively or dismissively or whatever it is that your protectors or managers kind of demand. But afterwards, you can realize I didn't do that very well. That's not the relationship I want to have with my kids. And you can go back and say, Jimmy, whatever your kid's name is, when you came to me, I responded in a dismissive or a defensive way, and that's not what I want. I really want to be here for you, and I want to listen to what you have to say. I think you were saying that you felt really depressed or really frustrated with your teacher. Can you tell me more about it? So then the kid can process it. And yes, there was that kind of we call it a attachment injury or a kind of like a break, but that can be repaired. And the repair and having the injury and the repair becomes part of the process. And people, the kids can learn and adults can learn too. This is a normal thing. This happens in our marriage. This happens with my kids. We're human. We make mistakes, but can fix it. We can repair the relationship. I can be self again. and be there for you in the way that helps you feel safe and invites you to be in that self state. Okay, a case example. So we have here Terry, age 35, full-time employed. Stacy, age 34, part-time employed. This is a second marriage for both of them. They've got 4 kids. Between them, they've got 1 kid together, or 2 kids together, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And they have a 13-year-old and an 11-year-old from previous marriages. They come into therapy because they are feeling disconnected from each other. Stacy is experiencing a lot of anxiety. Terry is getting depressed. So, just hearing that, okay, we've got some sympathetic nervous system stuff going on here with the anxiety, and we've got some dorsal vagal shut down with the depression. So clearly, just hearing that, there are some things that are happening within them and between them that mean they're not in self. They came in to work on communication, of course. Terry feels like he's always in trouble. He has a hard time connecting with his kids. He kind of feels like he has to be a rigid disciplinarian, can't be soft. Part of that is because maybe he thinks Stacy is too soft. She's all about like nurture, 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 but no consequences, no boundaries, and that bugs him. And so the 2 of them have gotten kind of polarized from each other, but also they have some polarized parts. Also, it's hard for Terry or Stacy to be vulnerable with each other. So, maybe Terry comes home from work, takes one look at Stacy's face, and he's like, great, she's mad at me. I don't even know why she's mad at me. And maybe he says, what? Why are you mad at me? She's like, nothing. There's nothing. It's fine. I don't know if this has ever happened for you. Anyway, this is a pretty, pulling from lots of different scenarios here. Anyway, and so he's like, maybe says, fine, if you don't want to tell me about it, then don't tell me about it. I'm going to go watch a movie or something. And then she gets mad because she's like, I've been taking care of the kids and trying to do my part-time job all day long, and now you just get to zone out. So there's some resentment, there's some hurt, there's definitely disconnection. So I would slow that down, recognize what parts are getting triggered in each person. So when Terry comes in the door and sees that in Stacy's face that she's upset with him or frustrated with him, one of his exiles gets triggered. He felt like he maybe he never felt like he was enough for his mom. Maybe he's always in trouble with his mom, and like no matter how good he tried to be, she always found something to be critical about. So it's like, great, fine. And so then, the exile gets triggered. A defensive part comes up, first trying to fix it. What is it? Like, what are you mad at me about? Kind of with this energy of, I didn't do anything wrong. And then when he gets criticized, that becomes overwhelming. So then another part takes over, and now we've got a withdrawing part. And so it's like, fine, whatever, I'm going to go. And he kind of numbs by distracting himself, going watching a movie. Maybe for Stacy, what's going on is she's feeling overwhelmed with the kids, and she doesn't feel like she did a very good job that day. Kind of the example I gave before with that interaction. She doesn't feel like she did a good job that day. That feeling like I didn't do a very good job. Maybe I didn't get the house clean. There's no dinner on the table. And so I'm kind of feeling like a failure, which triggers those feelings from her ex-husband, a feeling like everything was her fault and she wasn't good enough. And so that all happened before Terry had any idea. And so she, has that exile get triggered, and then a defensive part, and the defensive part is critical. And so, the defensive part is telling her, well, it's not your fault. All he has to do is go to work all day long, and leaves you with all of this such a martyr, and so there's just kind of this feeling of like, ugh, frustrated, that then gets pointed to him. There's kind of this like, you did this to me, I have to handle all this on my own, and it's not going well. If you were only around more, then maybe it would go better. And so that's her kind of defensive, protective part. Starts criticizing and blaming, and then when he goes away, that triggers that sense of abandonment, like maybe I'm not enough for him. And so then maybe she starts to get desperate. This picture has the two of them on the couch. Maybe there is a part of her that comes up that's like a people pleaser, and it's like, hey, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Can I get you something? I'll get dinner on in a minute. Or maybe she comes and sits down and is like, fine, if you're going to zone out, I'm going to zone out too. And I'm going to do this like game of chicken. Who's going to leave the kids longer? If I just sit down on the couch and do what you're doing, are you going to go get the kids? Or are you going to expect me to get the kids? So then, that's again, this defensive part that has a strategy of kind of trying to challenge the husband. So helping them slow down, recognize what parts were getting triggered, what that means for them, some of the schemas that are being brought up, some of the strategies that those parts have, and if possible, help them get to self, and maybe be able to turn to the other person. Maybe Terry can turn to Stacy and say, when I come in the door and it looks like you're already disappointed with me, that takes me back to feeling like I could never satisfy my mom. And I get really scared that I'll never satisfy you, and that you don't think I'm a very good husband, and that you won't want me. And so that's scary. And so I get kind of aggressive, and then I just shut down. And so if he can say it to her that way, that kind of invites her to see in a new way, see that it's not about her not being enough. He's not even seeing or thinking that she's not enough at all. There's nothing about that there for him. And so then that can kind of calm her parts, and maybe she can talk about, I felt like a failure today. I didn't have dinner on, the house wasn't clean, and I was afraid you would see that and just think I'm the worst and not want to have anything to do with me. And so I got critical of you. And, if they can say these things to each other, then it just opens up space for them to create new solutions, to reassure each other, to have safety for each other. So there you go. That's the end of the slideshow. And I hope that is understandable. This is pretty long because I pulled in those other videos. It's a pretty long lecture, but I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions in the lab, or of course, you can put them in digital dialogue also. Thanks so much.